Rider on the Storm. At the end of January, a few months before war broke out in Iraq, we were sitting on the patio outside Starbucks and the old Lorena movie theater. Noah's, just a few steps down the street, was closed for renovation. I was with a group of Armenians who met there almost every evening. I had moved to a table off to one side because Ara, a filmmaker who had grown up in Beirut and in 1975 during the Civil War had managed to escape to the U.S., was telling me a story from his childhood, and I wanted to hear how it ended. Ara was trying to retrieve his first movie experience. I no longer recall how we got onto this topic. At any rate, this experience was not as easy to remember as something like one's first kiss. As Ara began to describe his first film, the memory of an earlier film emerged, and from that another, and no sooner had he mentioned that one than fragments of a still earlier one rose to the surface, which he sensed he had seen at a time when I didn't distinguish between dream and reality. As the first raindrops began to fall and the rest of the group retreated into the cafe, we had taken refuge under the Starbucks umbrella next to Moby Disk. At that moment, Gary came tearing around the corner. He hesitated for a moment upon recognizing me, cast a disdainful glance at the Armenian, and broke into our conversation. "I've got to talk to you, man." I waved him off. Gary had moved into Rex's old apartment in the Starlight. Pete had introduced us. I no longer recall what I said, something along the lines of, "Not right now, wait for me in the cafe," though it was obvious to me that Gary was very upset. Actually, I saw at a glance that something must have gone awry between the 55-year-old Gary and the young woman he had introduced to us the night before on this same spot. He had been quivering and awkward, blushing with pride now and then. You could tell immediately that there would be trouble between them. Some of the Armenians even started making bets on him while Gary was arguing with others about the war ready to break out. At one point, Gary had stretched his left arm across the girl's knees and grasped the arm of her chair as if, using his arm as a shield, he were guarding her with his life. "Someone raped your woman," he exclaimed, "before your very eyes," and he reached for the chair arm. "And you want peace? They raped America, and you want to let them get away with it?" The girl gave a tense little smile and, to bridge over the embarrassing moment, slowly leaned far forward over Gary's arm. It looked as if she were leaning out a window to catch his eye. "Come on in, welcome," she exclaimed, laughing at Gary. The Armenians laughed too. Vahe, the painter, was much taken with Gary's date, and handed her and Gary invitations to the party he was giving the next evening. "My party, you must come." I left soon afterward. Ara's friends had told me the next morning that after leaving with his girl, Gary had turned up again at the cafe that evening, shortly after midnight, alone and crestfallen. Things got heated again at some point. Gary called Vahe, who had asked him several times for the girl's cell phone number, a fucking foreigner who didn't belong here. But Vahe had kept his cool and had pushed a $20 bill and then another across the table for the phone number. I don't give a damn what happens in Iraq, Gary shouted and tossed a crumpled piece of paper with a number onto the table. He was quite drunk, but had the presence of mind to pocket the money. Let's drop some nukes on them. We Americans could use more golf courses, were the parting words quoted to me. So this was the Gary who found us on the patio. I assumed he would wait for me in the cafe, or maybe not, and urged Ara to continue his story about those early encounters with film. In Burj Hammoud, the Armenian quarter in East Beirut, there were lots of movie houses, Ara continued. I remember the Kermanic, the Florida, the Royal, the Sevan, the Kanar, that's Armenian for harp, also used as a pretty girl's name, and the Madonna. But I think I saw my first film in the Cinema Arax. Next to the Cinema Arax was the Falafel Arax, which still exists, by the way, but it's in Hollywood now. Falafel Arax, on the corner of Normandy and Santa Monica Boulevard. Do you know it? No, I don't. We should go sometimes. The food tastes just the way it did in the 50s. Well, my sisters and their girlfriends, who always munched on black watermelon seeds during the movie, every half-grown-up person snacked on them, and at the end of the show, the floor was littered with the shells, stuffed me with falafel during this particular film. You'll see why and why I remember it. I was their little pet whom they had to feed the way the animals in the film were fed. It was one of those awful low-budget movies from Italy that we were inundated with at the time. Swords and sandals, Romans versus Germanic tribes, Christians versus lions. And this one was about the ark, the flood, God versus mankind. And Noah, I remember, had to feed his animals and probably didn't have enough fodder in his gloomy ark, so they went hungry, while I was being stuffed with falafel in the darkened theater. But at some point, I lost my appetite. I also no longer heard my sisters giggling. Something striking had happened on the screen. 10 minutes into the film, a group of boys in front of us shouted several times, "Hala balash al film," which meant essentially, "Now it's really starting." Ara paused. For a moment, I thought he must have been reminded of yet another film from even longer ago. "I have to tell this differently," he said, "because in my eyes, it wasn't a low-budget production, not even a film in the usual sense. What was it that had brought all these people together in this darkened place? And what made those boys, who'd been joking around with my sisters, suddenly face the screen and listen up?" Again, Ara paused for a moment. Now, I know why this film didn't occur to me sooner when I was trying to recall my first movie experience. Later, I made my sisters tell me the story again and again, so often that I remembered it as a fairy tale, one with vivid images, but like the tales in the books my sister read to me when they were putting me to bed at night. The film was about the ark, as I said, and Noah and his sons. He had 3 sons. But there was another. Another son? I don't think so. Or maybe he was a prodigal son, perhaps. I don't recall. At any rate, his name was But the film began with Noah, the building of the ark, and then the camera must have panned to the side, and there, in a thicket behind felled cedars, it focused in on him, this It looked as if he were lying in wait. He was spying on Noah and his sons, watching them bring animals, select them, and then drive them in pairs up the ramp and into the ark. Then slipped away, and we followed him. Ara raised his hands as if he were following with his camera. So why do I remember this? I think had huge muscles. He could easily have picked me up and carried me on his shoulders, without setting me down suddenly, as my sisters did almost immediately. Now I accompanied through the underbrush, through a forest, and came to a hut where he lived with his wife. "Is your baby story going to take long?" I heard Gary saying behind me, Gary, whose name meant the spear. He had pulled a chair under the overhang between the cafe and the CD shop and was sitting there with hunched shoulders, smoking and nervously whipping his foot into the rain. "You're talking heathen nonsense, falsifying the Bible. Noah didn't have a prodigal son." Ara refused to raise to the bait. "This woman, I don't remember her name, loved her," Ara continued. "You could tell because while she was cooking, he came to her. He crouched by the open fire and gently encircled her ankle with one hand, while with the other he covered his troubled face, making it look as if he were just shielding it from the heat of fire. My eldest sister, who couldn't read the Arabic subtitles but could follow the French ones, said, "He wants to save himself and his wife from the flood. But by now, Noah is letting only animals onto the boat, so it's too late for the couple." When his wife had fallen asleep, was too troubled to sleep, he slipped out, checked the water in the well, searched the night sky for stars, but saw none. Then put his ear to the ground, as if trying to hear what was happening beneath the surface. Then he made his way to the river bank, having heard that a sorcerer spoke there at night with the animals. Once he arrived at the river, he came upon people who were feasting and dancing, wedding guests, as he could see, while an army of cooks and servants bustled around, slaughtering and roasting the animals and serving the bridal pair and their guests. One of the servants catches him by the goat pen, behind which he has crouched to watch the goings-on, and drags him in front of the cooks, who report him to the masters. The bride and groom, it seems, want to see who's messing around with the cook's goats, and he is dragged by the hair through the laughing throng to face the couple. They question him, and when he begins to speak, his fear of the flood and the annihilation that will soon befall all those who didn't find a place in the ark seems to communicate itself to the other guests. In the ensuing agitation, implores the sorcerer, who is supposed to be somewhere in the crowd, to have pity on him. He looks around pleadingly and asks that he and his beloved wife be transformed into animals so they can be let into Noah's ark. At that, the bridegroom rises from his seat, throws off his bridal cloak, and sees the pinions of an angel. "If it comes, this flood," the angel addresses him, "it will destroy everyone, me, my bride, my guests and servants, you and your wife, and, this much is certain, all those who have taken refuge in the ark. Do you not know," he says, "that the divine waters that are coming contain fire so hot that everything they surround will be consumed? This ark, like kindling, and the pitch with which Noah is sealing the cracks will melt like wax in a flame, and even the ashes of the ark will glow so hot that they will be driven through the water like a storm blazing from the abyss with black sparks. Therefore, live, exclaimed the angel. Transcend your fear. But repeats his plea. Turn us into 2 animals, that we may mount the ramp in time and find refuge in the ark. The angel beckoned to a servant, and heard an animal being led up behind him and heard the snorting of a horse. When he turned around, the angel seized hold of him and lifted him onto the animal's back. It was a large goat antelope with 3 long, black, twisted horns. Suddenly the ground disappeared under the animal. Saw no more sand beneath him, and in the depths, above which the animal's hooves hovered, nothing but stars, the night sky which he had thought was above his head. And he threw his head back. Around him only the starry night, nothing else, no one else. And what lay before him, night and far off in the distance, a glowing mist of stars, was divided in 4 by the animal's long horns. Fearfully he grasped the goat's pelt as the animal began to move. When he touched it, courage surged through him so powerfully that as the goat trotted out into the universe, he fainted and tumbled off. In the gray light of dawn, he awakened in the rain. No trace of the ghostly company, as if he had dreamed it all. The river was rising rapidly. Hurried home, where he found that his wife was gone. The cottage stood empty. The bed where his wife had lain asleep only hours before looked trampled. He saw the tracks of an animal, a goat, on the floor, leading out of the house towards the forest in the direction of the ark, he thinks. Then the trail is washed away by the rain. Everywhere the ground is opening up, but instead of being absorbed, the waters are bubbling out of the fissures. As tries to make his way through the forest, he meets groups of people also trying to reach the ark. Suddenly they hear a mighty roar behind them, and an enormous wave rushes through the forest, pulling down trees and sweeping them all along. Now, Ara continued, the image on the screen resembled what I saw on Saturdays when I was bathed in the tub and opened my eyes underwater while my sister's hands reached in to hold me. At first you saw only what saw, and then you saw him being buffeted by the current, struggling to get his head above water and being forced down time and again by steaming boulders and knots of human beings from which he could free himself only with the greatest difficulty. He almost lost consciousness. But there was also fire burning underwater. They had simply superimposed glowing embers over the shot, very primitive but effective. The water was on fire, consuming everything in it. And you saw face contorted with pain, and his tunic appeared to be burning around his hips, while his arms flailed above his head but couldn't reach the surface. Then blackness appeared before his eyes, as if everything were going dark, but what looked like a huge boulder rushed towards him. A moment later, he was clinging to it and being swept along. You saw spread-eagled, hanging on with both hands as if onto the body of a whale, his hands digging into the whale's black hide. Eventually you realized that it was no whale, but the ark itself. Was clinging to the side of the ark, which was being catapulted through the water, swept under, then hurtled to the surface. And once the ark righted itself and was floating on the water again, you saw through a dense curtain of rain that had jammed his hands and feet into the thick pitch with which the gaps between the hewn logs had been sealed, and was thus held tight by the ark, like someone crucified with his face to the cross. And you saw that from the sea on whose waves the ark was drifting, smoke rose up the ark's wooden sides, searing them with blazing spray. In places, they were already on fire, and the pitch with which they were sealed was dripping like wax from the cracks. Now you saw a scene inside the ark, utter chaos. Noah's sons were trying to put out the fire, and the animals were in a panic and could not be quieted. The wooden sides were groaning as the masses of water hit them. Where the pitch had melted completely, water was spewing through the gaps between the planks, throwing smoky flames into the animals' feed as the creatures roared and raved. The wooden structure seemed about to split apart. Then came a close-up of goats and antelopes in one of the stalls. They were struggling to get away from the exterior wall of the vessel because in several places boiling water was bursting through. But one animal was striving to reach that very spot, pushing the others out of the way. And in the film, you knew or sensed that it was none other than Er's enchanted beloved. And now a cross-section through the smoking wall of the ark became visible, showing both sides of the wall that separated and the goat. You also knew or sensed it won't be long now. On the right, you saw the goat's head butting through the softened pitch and tar in the wall, or already breaking through. A hose-like tunnel had opened up. It was like those films in which you look through a mouse's burrow, the camera providing a cross-section from the best vantage point. As the goat's mouth ate its way through the wall, on the other side of the wall, clinging to the exterior of the ark, you saw The boat's side in front of him opened gradually, forming a peephole through which he could now see her, and she him, one eye gazing into the other. I don't recall how the rest of the action was filmed, but later my sisters recounted, when I made them tell me the story, that in the moment when the two caught sight of each other, the fires that had broken out in the ark died down, as did the fires outside. The smoke in the rafters dissipated, as if this unflinching meeting of the eyes had surrounded the ark with a protective mantle that prevented the waters from doing any more harm. Here, someone had been reunited with his transformed beloved, never to lose her. In the end, as you know, Ara continued, the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat in Armenia. And when the waters had receded, the door of the ark was opened, the ramp was lowered, and the animals were driven out. And Noah and his sons set about making offerings. One of the sons reached for the she-goat, but it darted away and hid among the other animals. And Noah's son took another. And now you saw a wide shot, actually another cross-section. On the right, you could see the animals leaving the ark, passing the burnt offering that Noah was tending as the sun rose. And on the left side of the ark, in its shadow, you caught sight of Drained of strength, he was sitting on the ground, leaning against the planks of the vessel. Then the she-goat came dashing around the bow, and now you saw her very close up, found the exhausted man, and knelt beside him, first leaning over him, then laying her head on his chest. And put his arms around her. As he held her, he opened his mouth, and from his mouth poured water, a mouthful, that he hadn't swallowed, water that was still warm because it had been hot from the fiery waters of the flood. As let the water flow onto her head, it dripped warm onto her pelt and over his hands as they held her, and suddenly the woman was lying in his arms, restored. And they looked at one another. You saw the two stand up, and his wife, and you asked yourself whether they would forever go unrecognized as they set out, leaving the shadow of the ark for the bright horizon. Lightning flashed several times above Mulholland. It was raining harder now as I drove through the hills a little while later with Gary.